How did LEGO heads go from this to this and this? When LEGO first launched, its offerings were pretty sparse. It took LEGO a pretty long time to populate LEGO City, but soon it all changed. The very first LEGO figures were released all the way back in 1974 and are barely even recognizable as LEGO products today. Set number 200, simply called Family, was LEGO's first attempt to introduce plastic people and was fairly successful. These were called homemakers, but you also may know them as maxi figures. They hardly resemble proper modern minifigures, but they were the very first playable figures that LEGO ever put out. As you can see though, the heads have a surprising level of detail for LEGO's first characters. These figures are definitely more concerned with accuracy, as the heads are all round instead of cylinders, and even have studs on either side to look like ears. One interesting difference between these and modern heads of minifigures is that on the bottom, instead of a hole, they had a Technic pin. Now, while these heads would continue to be used for the rest of the 1970s, they were inherently doomed. These figures were incredibly posable, however, the scale of them simply didn't match up with the scale of much of what LEGO was building. Today, the term minifigure scale is very common for describing the size of a build, and is roughly 1 to 42 scale, which basically means if you stacked 42 minifigures on top of each other, you get a tower about as tall as an average human being. Today, many sets like modular buildings and vehicles are built to this same minifigure scale to keep everything proportionate. And while modern minifigures are 3 bricks tall, these original figures were as much as 9 bricks tall. So trying to create something like the Daily Bugle to accommodate that size of a figure would be simply impossible, not to mention how huge and extremely expensive this massive LEGO set hypothetically would be. So while we got a few vehicles and playsets that fit these figures, LEGO quickly moved on. Primarily because the very next year, in 1975, LEGO released the next generation of minifigure, and we finally got what we would mostly recognize today as a proper LEGO headpiece. Now, saying that these original minifigures lacked detail is an understatement. I mean, these figures had no arms, immobile legs, and most importantly, no printing on their heads. In fact, for the first several years after release, LEGO only ever released plain, unprinted yellow heads for every minifigure. At the time, printing on LEGO pieces was still very rare, so it's understandable. In fact, these early minifigures were entirely unprinted, and some even came with stickers. Even though LEGO could print at this time, the challenge and increased cost of printing on round pieces was simply really not worth it for what was then considered to be an experimental piece. But of course, that was all about to change in 1978 with the release of what we now consider proper minifigures. Builders opening up sets from the LEGO City, Space, and Castle themes were treated to something new, a figure designed by the legendary Jens Nygaard-Knudsen. These figures had posable arms and legs, and even more importantly, they had actual faces. At the time, it's hard to imagine that anyone at LEGO knew just how iconic these little yellow blocks would become, but the printed faces on these new figures were an instant hit. 2 black dots and a small smile were all that was needed to bring these little fellas to life, but the decision to keep it minimal at first wasn't necessarily a cost-saving move or a technical limitation, but rather it was a very deliberate choice by the designer. You see, LEGO has always made an effort to be as inclusive as possible, and that goes back as far as these first minifigure heads. The yellow that is now synonymous with LEGO was chosen as it was viewed as the most neutral color to use. It's easy to forget that at the time in the late 70s, LEGO only had a small handful of colors at their disposal. Plus, the world-famous yellow smiley face was gaining popularity in pop culture at a rapid speed, and this yellow color available to LEGO was also the highest contrast for printing other than white. So it was the obvious choice. Over the next 14 years, nothing would really change, and the now celebrated minifigure head became a childhood staple for an entire generation of builders. During this time, though, there were 2 small developments, Duplo and Technic. By 1978, Duplo had been around for a decade, and in set 534, Bath Toy Boat, we got our very first Duplo figure. But what's even better is that it actually came with a fully printed face, complete with freckles and everything. Now, in 1982, LEGO officially launched the Technic line, and the scale of these vehicles was significantly larger than the standard LEGO sets. In 1986, with the Technic Arctic theme, LEGO brought back larger figures. These Technic figures were close in size to the original Housemakers, and feature similar round heads with ears molded onto the sides. However, whereas the Homemakers had Technic pins for the neck, these new figures had a ball joint, allowing for even more movement. Interestingly though, LEGO decided to give these figures a wide range of printed expressions and accessories, making these the most varied faces that LEGO has ever put out. But that honor wouldn't last for very long at all, because in 1989, LEGO had realized that there was a strong desire for a little more variety in minifigure faces. Specifically, the release of the Pirates theme saw several drastic changes to what LEGO was willing to do with minifigures. From peg legs to hook hands, it seemed like everything was on the table, and yes, that did include new faces. Figures such as the female pirate and the absolutely unforgettable Captain Redbeard were truly jaw-dropping at the time. Redbeard was such an important milestone for LEGO that he was even commemorated in the recent minifigure tribute set with his unforgettable face recreated as a single large tile. But this was only the beginning, because throughout the 1990s, LEGO would unleash an entire universe of minifigures with different expressions. This was certainly one of LEGO's most experimental times. They weren't afraid to try new things out. It's funny to look at the collection of heads from this time, because there's absolutely no uniform art style. Each team was seemingly allowed to go in whatever direction they wanted, and this resulted in several minifigure firsts. In 1992, we got the very first minifigure with eyewear. This head took the standard head design and replaced the two black dots that made up the eyes with a pair of sunglasses. These heads were originally used for the LEGO City officers, but quickly made their way to pilots, doctors, and eventually your average LEGO City resident. But as anyone who's ever worn glasses will tell you though, they're about a lot more than just keeping the sun out of your eyes, and LEGO has used them to create some incredible minifigure heads. The LEGO Adventurers line gave us this bearded and bespectacled bloke as both Dr. Charles Lightning in the Desert theme, as well as Dr. Killjoy in the Orient Adventure line. We also got Biker Bob with this very unique face, as well as this one from Lord Sam Sinister. In 1997's Freestyles theme, we also got introduced to the now famous Timmy minifigure. While this minifigure is fairly bare bones by today's standards, the face was an immediate hit with fans. While LEGO had printed freckles before on Homemakers, Technic figures, and even Duplo, this was the first time that this feature had ever been seen on an actual standard minifigure. By the end of the decade though, LEGO had slowly begun to settle into a slightly more unified style, and in 2000 they added a small white dot to the inside of each minifigure eye to give it just a little twinkle, which might be one of the most underrated changes to the design of a minifigure head ever. But even with these new prints, the head itself was the exact same element it had always been, a simple yellow cylinder, and up until 1992 these simple heads had a full solid stud on top. But that was about to change. You see, in the early 1990s, LEGO changed the mold for the heads to include a small hole on top. This was done around the same time that similar holes started to appear in plastic pen caps. The idea was that the hole would allow air to pass through and help prevent choking if swallowed. On the left, you can see the original head with a full stud, and right next to it, we've got the redesigned version. This design stuck around until about 2010 when they were slowly phased out. But why did LEGO get rid of these air holes? Well, the reasons are slightly unclear, but it does seem that these tiny holes were simply too small to actually allow for a reasonable amount of air to pass through. These holes would not prevent choking, so LEGO decided to fill that hole but still have the indention. LEGO has mentioned that this has allowed them to also place their logo on top to help consumers spot counterfeit minifigure heads. However, this was actually the smallest change happening at the time, so let me discuss this huge milestone in the evolution of minifigures, and while I do so, please take 2 seconds to tap subscribe. It's the best way to support my channel, and it's completely free. Alright, so at the turn of the 21st century, LEGO was undergoing one of the most massive shifts in the company's entire history, and minifigure heads would play a key role in it. On April 1st, 1999, LEGO released Set 7110, the Land Speeder, and while it might not look like much, it's one of LEGO's biggest milestones. This set included the very first licensed minifigure ever released in a LEGO set, and marked a huge turning point for how LEGO handled minifigure heads. Up until this point, minifigures were blank canvases for anyone to project a character onto. But suddenly, this wasn't just any LEGO figure. This was Luke Skywalker, the hero of the Rebellion. Over the next few years, as LEGO added more and more licenses to its catalog, the number of characters and people being portrayed in plastic skyrocketed, and the need for more realistic skin tones became apparent. Now, although LEGO had officially released minifigures of different ethnicities before, it's safe to say that they kind of missed the mark. I mean, just look at 1997's Indian Chief set to see what I mean. At this point, all minifigure heads were still coming in yellow. However, by 2004, LEGO had expanded its color options enough and had heavily committed to licensed sets, so we began seeing minifigure heads and hands in a wide range of natural skin tones that more accurately reflected the original actors and characters. The first minifigures to make use of the newly expanded range of skin tones were all launched in 2003 and covered both Star Wars and the NBA. While these might not seem to have much in common on the surface, both are well known for showing a fairly wide range of skin tones. 2003's Cloud City set is one of the most sought after LEGO sets of all time, and that's largely for the minifigures, with an original Boba Fett from this set selling for upwards of $3,000 nowadays. However, that minifigure, while very cool, isn't nearly as important to LEGO's history as this one. Yup, Lando Calrissian made his off-screen debut here and really stands out, not only because of his at the time brand new and more authentic skin tone color, but because none of the other figures in this set had been updated to match. Every other minifigure is still yellow in this set. That same year, we got a series of minifigures based on real people as opposed to fictional characters. LEGO put out a handful of NBA players as both standalone minifigures and small collections, with builders able to get their hands on their very own Kobe Bryant, Tim Duncan, or even Shaq himself. With all of these licensed likenesses, it was incredibly important to recreate the real person as accurately as possible. This led to the development of several new skin tones and face designs. And while themes like LEGO City still use original yellow heads, more and more themes are embracing this diversity in skin color. There was, however, one more small change about to happen to minifigure heads at this time: dual printing. Up until 2001, every minifigure head had a single expression. While these were easy enough to swap out as needed, there was a single character who needed to have two faces so badly that LEGO decided to give us the very first double-sided head. In Harry Potter and the Philosopher's Stone, Professor Quirrell has been secretly taken over by the Dark Lord Voldemort and has managed to keep his secret heavily under wraps. However, on the back of his head, he who shall not be named is waiting and whispering. To drive this point home, LEGO decided to give him a truly unique head that showed both sides of the character. However, there was still one more extreme change coming, and it all started with Star Wars Episode 1 and Jar Jar Binks. Yup, it turns out that before we ever got natural human skin tones, we got a fully molded Gungan head in 1999, which was 4 years prior to Lando and the NBA minifigures. This minifigure is the very first to have a non-standard head and was released alongside a whole range of yellow-headed companions. Once LEGO started creating custom molded heads, it seemed like they just couldn't stop. Over the next few years, we got several never-before-seen minifigure heads, but they were all still a little bit bland. As these heads became a bigger and bigger part of many of LEGO's flagship sets, though, the need for more detail printing became obvious. Just take a look at the most recent Jar Jar from 2015 to see how far LEGO has come. Today, the variety of sizes and shapes of LEGO minifigure heads is seemingly infinite, with new molds being released every year and odd colors such as this head for Green Goblin. One recent surprising change to the classic minifigure head can be seen on the Disney Pinocchio minifigure. This little guy has a 3D nose. While other heads have had printed noses in the past, none of them have ever been given a physical, tangible proboscis. Honestly, I really like the bold decision that LEGO made here, but sometimes LEGO makes really weird decisions. So click here right now to see those, and subscribe so you don't miss my next LEGO video.